This is Distant Replay, the podcast that goes back in time to relive all the greatest events that we witnessed in sports. From upsets, to championships, to cultural moments, we discuss it all. Coming up on today's episode.
Still one timeout left here for Texas Tech. 8 seconds.
Second down now. Deep strike. Got the big man. Crabtree. Goes free. And touchdown. Red Raiders with a second to
go. Going back to 2008 for a heck of a game between Texas and Texas Tech, an electric atmosphere, one of the best atmospheres you'll find for a college game. And there's some really good ones, but this night was crazy. And this was like the Big 12 at its peak in the mid to late 2000s. There's a lot to love about this game, and we're going to dive into it today on Distant Replay Podcast. Welcome in. I am Ben George alongside Mike Noto. And Mike, back to college football now. And I threw this game out there to you, and I think you were kind of like, which game was this again? But I think you're pretty happy we went back and watched this one.
Oh, for sure. As I fired up this game and started watching it, it definitely came back. Where I was watching it, how awesome of a game it was. And like you mentioned, this is the era for the Big 12, right? This is right after, the 2006 Rose Bowl, a couple of years after that. And we have 4 or 5 teams that would spend time in the top 10 from this conference. And this was sort of emblematic of that. Just a great game from start to finish.
Yeah, we got a lot to talk about during this episode, but let me first remind you, distantreplaypodcast.com is the website. We'll put this game there, so if you want to go back and watch it yourself, the YouTube link will be right there. Stream it to your TV, watch it, relive it. You'll enjoy it. Also, you can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube as well. All of our shows are put up on YouTube if you prefer to listen that way. And subscribe for us, please, if you would, and leave us a review. We would appreciate that. So November 1st, 2008 was the date. Mike, do you remember where you were for this game?
I do. I was at a local sports bar watching it with one of our mutual friends.
You got to shout out Sliders for all of our Connecticut people listening.
Yeah, I got to shout out Sliders, local sports bar chain here. And, it was one of those places where when there was a good national Saturday college football game at night, this is where we would go watch it. And this is in my heyday here. And anyone who has kids know what I mean. So this is during the time period where I got out of college, got a job, had a little bit of money in my pocket, and before I had my first kid. So
right, not yet married yet.
This was heyday. Yeah. And I was not even married yet. Exactly. That might be the biggest factor.
So, this game was on ABC, Texas Tech. Texas at the time, number 1 in the country, every single poll. Texas Tech, also undefeated. Both these teams were 8-0. Texas Tech was 7th in the BCS. They were as high as 5th going into this game in the coaches poll. So, huge game. This is Texas Tech is traditionally not the same level of Texas, right? I mean, that's pretty easy to understand, college football fan or not. Tech came into this having beaten Texas just one time in the previous 9 years. Even a couple years prior to this game in Lubbock, they were up, I think, 21-0 and failed to close that game out. So you go into this game, and this Texas Tech team is not on the same level, but this is our opportunity, Mike, to kind of prove their worth and their value in the college football national landscape.
I couldn't have put it any better than you did just now. When you thought of the Big 12, you thought of Texas and Oklahoma first and foremost. And then you would have maybe like an Oklahoma State that would have a good year every once in a while. Maybe you would have a Missouri that went on a little bit of a run, but never Texas Tech. It was this team that you thought, wow, you know what? Against average teams or below average teams, this offense will score 50, 60, 70 points. But once they play a team with good athletes, they won't be able to hang. That was sort of the backdrop to Texas Tech for years.
Yeah, and even at this time, Nebraska was still in the Big 12, so they were obviously a team that was always at the top during this period. Colorado was still in there before all the changing of conferences and the realignment. But you had Texas Tech, who had been pretty good now for a number of years under Mike Leach. He had kind of built this program up, and they're in a pretty good spot. But this is a big opportunity for Texas Tech on the national scene because you talk about the BCS rankings, Mike, and we go back to this time, and it's kind of interesting looking at the BCS rankings heading into this game because let's be honest, since the college football playoffs have started and a little bit before that, it seems to be the same teams recycled almost every single year, right? 6 to 8 teams, but really the top 2 or 3 seem to be there year in, year out. Alabama, Clemson, Georgia, Oklahoma, LSU. I mean, you're seeing these same teams year in, year out. You go back to these BCS standings, and this week heading into this game, Texas number 1 at 8-0, Alabama number 2 at 8-0, which I had, it kind of hit me. Hey, this is like the beginning of the dynasty for Alabama, which was kind of surprising to me, just remembering it, the time frame of this. Penn State was 9-0. They were 3rd. Oklahoma. Then you had USC at 5, and then Georgia at 6. So a lot of the same teams, but you still had Utah in there, Boise State, and Oklahoma State. So there's a lot of teams towards this list, but Texas Tech definitely stands out among those as a team that you're not always accustomed to seeing in the spot.
Yeah, and you mentioned the Alabama team. So that was, now you got to remember, back then, this wasn't like the Alabama now. This was, wow, Alabama's good again. This is awesome. You know?
Yeah.
I think it's important to set the scene there. It wasn't like Alabama coming off a decade where they've been in the top 5. So between them, Texas Tech, you know, and even a Georgia was always really good, but never in like that top 5 conversation, you know, because they always had Florida and Tennessee to deal with. So yeah, some interesting teams at the top of those BCS rankings.
Yeah, this Alabama team, this is Saban coming off after his first year. This is Saban's second year. They weren't very good. They were basically 500 the year prior. Not a lot of expectations, not a lot of high hopes, and they turned it around really quickly in this Alabama team. And it kind of came back to me, Mike, why this game was so important to me too, because Alabama was on the cusp of being number 1, right? They hadn't been number 1 in the spot in a long time. It's weird to think about now, but sitting there thinking, man, if Texas somehow loses this game, all of a sudden Alabama is number 1 in the BCS rankings. This is real now all of a sudden. And that's kind of what I remember thinking looking back on it. So that's kind of where we are setting the stage nationally for this game. And, you know, the big thing about this right now, and you pointed out Big 12's at this heyday right now, Texas' schedule this season. And this is part of the problem with where they were in this game. They came in October having played, okay, forget the first game at Colorado, still a tough game in Boulder. They came in playing number 1, Oklahoma, number 11, Missouri, number 7, Oklahoma State, and now they have number 6, Texas Tech. These are all in consecutive weeks, no bye games.
Yeah, that's a loaded schedule. And both these teams, if you look at their game-by-game schedules, both these teams had loaded schedules, and that was a function of the Big 12 being very, very good this season.
Yeah, I always think that Big 12's never done themselves a favor in terms of scheduling. Because, like, you look at Texas Tech's schedule, to your point, this year, they had played, coming into this game, they had just come off of playing number 19 Kansas. Yeah, Kansas was ranked top 25 at this point. Texas, then they had behind Texas, they had Oklahoma State, who was 8th, and then Oklahoma, who was 5th. And I mean, another gauntlet for them as well. And they were all kind of bunched up, and it proved to be the undoing for both teams, honestly.
Yeah, and please don't insult the Mark Mangino era in Kansas. I'm pretty sure this was the Mark Mangino era, wasn't it? The year before this, they were in the top 5 at one point, and I think they made Mangino. a BCS game.
Yeah, it was Mangino. You're correct.
Yeah,
so I won't disrespect that.
Yeah. I mean, the year before they made a BCS game, and then they came back and were solid this year as well. So. Very, very, your boy Les Miles there now, the furthest thing from even a bowl team. But, yep, just something of note. But, yeah, this conference, the way they schedule, they always seem to sort of knock each other out of contention.
This was College Gameday's first trip to Lubbock as well. As you can imagine, they were on hand for this game. And the guest picker, Mike, who was it?
Bobby Knight.
Bobby Knight.
Now, let me ask you something. How would one get on a plane to Lubbock, Texas?
That's a good question. Never done it.
Oof. God, that's out in West Texas, isn't it?
Yeah, I believe so. But I don't know where you. I'm sure Lubbock has a pretty decent sized airport. I mean, I don't think Lubbock's a tiny town, but
that sounds like a place you're at the airport and you're in a Southwest terminal and you're like, wow, Southwest goes to Lubbock.
Yeah,
that seems like that kind of moment.
He's flying to Lubbock right now. There's no game this weekend. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, so they were there on hand. Bobby Knight, obviously with his ties coaching Texas Tech, was the game day picker. And the other big thing about this game, in retrospect now, this game featured 3 of the top 5 Heisman finishers in 2008.
Yeah, so you had Colt McCoy, the quarterback of Texas, obviously, was second in the Heisman voting. You had Graham Harrell, the quarterback from Texas Tech, was 4th in the Heisman voting. And Michael Crabtree, who was an absolute beast in this game and a beast of a college receiver as a whole, the Biletnikoff winner the year before, was actually 5th in the Heisman voting this year. So I'm trying to remember a single game outside of maybe the Texas USC game with Leinart, Vince Young, and Reggie Bush where I've ever watched a game where 3 guys have been in the top 5 of a Heisman.
Yeah, I think that's a good comparison. There's probably been a spot where, there was a 5th guy that was a receiver that wasn't really in the mix, but ended up in that spot in terms of voting. But Crabtree was legit. He's in the conversation. He was dynamic and really good in this system under Mike Leach. I don't think he could have picked a better place to go to school. And watching this game again is just like, man, I mean, he could not have been in a better system under Mike Leach. He was perfect fit for what he was trying to do with that air raid.
Yeah, and you got to remember now, this is legitimizing Texas Tech as a place you can go and become a good NFL player, right? I think it started with Wes Welker, who was a Texas Tech receiver. Then it continued with Michael Crabtree. People saw the success like a Graham Harrell had, where he did things in a little more of a realistic pro type of way with good weapons around him. And then it would lead to, the Baker Mayfields who started his career at Texas Tech, and Patrick Mahomes, of course, really becoming a place where, hey, look, you could be a legitimate pro quarterback and play your career at Texas Tech.
Yeah, that's a good point. It did kind of legitimize everything they were doing, and their program is, they're not going to be a team that's going to win 10 games every year, but they're going to have those years where, they pick a couple guys up that all come together and they're right there at the top to compete for the Big 12 and possibly a spot in the playoff. So yeah, we've kind of seen that since that time. That's a good point to what you said there, Mike. So let's talk players since we're on that topic. Let's start with Texas. I mean, Texas's team, obviously, this is kind of, we're 3 years removed from that Rose Bowl, Vince Young and Lionel and Bush, as you pointed out. So this is, peak Mac Brown as well. This is Texas year in, year out. Okay, we expect this team to be in the mix for the national championship, unlike what we've seen the last 10 years, honestly, since really this season or the next. But Colt McCoy, the quarterback. Colt McCoy to Shipley, that was this duo was so good. Kind of post Vince, Colt slipped right in there and was very good for this team. And in this game, he broke the record for passing yards at Texas.
Colt McCoy was just an incredible college.
Is there a better, by the way, Mike, a better quarterback that fits the Texas brand than Colt McCoy?
No, there isn't. I mean, he's from Texas, son of a coach. The whole stuff that the announcing teams and the Tom Rinaldi's of the world absolutely fawn over. You can't. And plus he performed on the field. Which is the biggest thing. And right out of Central Casting, and overall, this team, McCoy was the focal point because of very nondescript weapons around him, all very athletic, good players, but no one that really stood out and no one that would really go on to any pro career of consequence that I can think of. I mean, Fozzie Whitaker was in the pros for a little bit, but he wasn't a great pro. The defensive side of the ball for Texas featured Brian Arakpo. Him and, believe it or not, Justin Tucker was the kicker and the punter for Texas in this game. He might have ended up being the best pro out of everyone in this game.
Well, the crazy thing, he wasn't even kicking. He was just a punter in this game as a true freshman.
Oh, he was just the punter.
Yeah, Hunter Lawrence was the kicker. He was
Interesting.
A junior. Yeah, so you look back and you're like, man, this guy wasn't even kicking field goals for him. But he was a freshman backing up a guy that had been there for a few years.
I watched the whole game. I saw him punt. I just figured he was kicking.
You just assumed,
But Colt McCoy was everything for this team. And this is, again, like you said, peak Mac Brown. This is Mac Brown just rolls out top recruiting classes every year. Again, coming off of that the Vince Young era. And Texas is an absolute wagon at this point.
Yeah, Quan Cosby, I think, played a few years in the league. Earl Thomas was on this team, too, as a redshirt freshman.
Yep.
In this game. He would obviously he's had a very decorated career. So they had a few pieces there, and this team would get much better the following year, but they were right on the cusp here of being a championship contender. On the other side, Texas Tech, Harrell, we mentioned, Harrell and then Crabtree were really the two names off this. I mean, there's some guys you probably remember, Mike, like Charbonnet, who was a safety kind of linebacker defensive player for them that was pretty good. But was there anybody on this team that you really remembered going back and watching this game?
Besides for Harrell and Crabtree, there wasn't. The only other guy I recognized, unfortunately, was Adam James, which I'm sure we'll get to him here at some point in this episode.
So yes, I mean not a super decorated roster, but Harrell was one of the top quarterbacks to ever play collegiate football, especially from a statistical perspective. And he had Crabtree, who was all everything, Blitnikoff, Big 12 first team, All-American, top 5 Heisman vote getter. So he was dynamic in this, and kind of sets up what we expect to see in this game: a high-powered offense in Texas Tech versus a Texas team that's kind of well-rounded, pretty balanced, but definitely not that offensive approach. Can score, but definitely not the same mold of Texas Tech. Coaches, Mike, I thought coaches were interesting in this game. We talked Mac Brown already. He's in his 11th season at Texas, has a national championship. His defensive coordinator for the first season is Will Muschamp, who slid in there.
Will Muschamp, who looked so young in this game, didn't he?
Yeah, he did.
He looked so – if you want to know what the difference between being a coordinator and a head coach is, take a look at Will Muschamp in this game and take a look at a recent picture of Will Muschamp. That's what being a head coach does to you. Man, he was really – if you remember at this time, all kidding aside, he was one of like the coordinators that was touted to be a head coach at one of these big programs. He was one of the chosen ones.
Yeah, and he was only 37 at the time too, so he was real young in terms of looking young as well. He's still only 49 years old. It seems like he's been around the game forever. But yeah, he kind of slid in, coming over from Auburn, where he was there for a season or two, came over to Texas, and eventually became the head coach in waiting before he just couldn't wait any longer and left for Florida. But he was the defensive coordinator there. So, pretty good staff there. Seeing Muschamp there definitely brought back some memories. On the other side, you had Texas Tech, who, their big thing, I think Leach was the offensive coordinator for this team. I think he led the offense, but you had Ruffin McNeil. He made a pretty big impact, and they talked about it quite a bit in this game.
Yeah, what Texas Tech used to lack was being able to compete with these bigger teams like a Nebraska, Oklahoma, Texas on the lines, right? On the defensive line and on the offensive line. But taking a look at it from a defensive standpoint, this defense had the athletes, had the defensive line, and then had a coordinator in Ruffin McNeil who sort of took them to that next level where they could even be competitive in a game like this.
Yeah, Ruffin he kind of came up to the system starting as a linebacker coach in 2000 there and eventually got elevated all the way up to D.C. and left, I think, a year or two later for East Carolina, where he was the head coach for 5 or 6 years. So those are your coaches, Mike. And let's jump into the broadcast itself. You had ESPN HD on ABC is how they used to present it. You remember that back in the early HD days when you had the ABC games on, but they still wanted to keep the ESPN branding attached to it. It was Brent Musburger and Kirk Herbstreit, and I think Lisa Salters, but having Brent and Kirk together, I mean, those two guys, just a classic.
Yeah, this was like a comet that came into our life for a brief moment, and it was great while it was here.
It was beautiful.
Those two together, I had forgotten they were even together, but they're an excellent announcing team. I mean, when I think of college football, I think of Brent Musburger as a play-by-play guy, and I think of Herbstreit as an analyst. So to put these two together in this environment was perfect. And Lisa Salters, she's been on a lot of these games that we've covered, she's great as well. Yeah,
she is. But these two, yeah, they're classic. I couldn't find a point spread for this one, Mike. Could you?
I could not find one either.
Yeah, I don't know exactly where we were. I was trying to gauge throughout this whether or not we knew who Brent Musburger had on this game. Did you have a sense either way who he might have picked in this game?
I did not have a sense of who he had, but I had the sense that he may have had the over because on the opening kickoff, as the kicker was kicking the ball, he said, "Let the scoring begin."
Yeah. Yep, I have that on my notes as well. First play.
So maybe Brett did not go with a side. He went with the total.
Yeah, it could very well be the case. Well, anything else to get into pregame before we jump into this one, Mike?
You covered everything that I was going to get to. Very good job.
All right, let's jump into it then. First quarter, as Mike mentioned, and I have in my notes as well. This game starts off on the broadcast. We go right to the opening kickoff, no pregame stuff. But the first thing we hear is Brent Musburger saying, "Let the scoring begin." And I'm sure, I guess the total was probably in the 60s, maybe even touch 70. Who knows where it ended up. But I noticed that too, Mike. Like he's probably got the over, or at least he's very aware of where the point total is for this game. So let's go through quarter by quarter, just some notes on these quarters. Crabtree gets banged up early on. We didn't really see much coming from it. His first catch, he kind of hobbled off the field, and I thought, okay, maybe this could have been a bigger deal, but he comes back pretty quickly. I think they mentioned at one point he took some pills. I think Lisa Salter says he popped some pills. Maybe she didn't say pop, but she took some pills. She wasn't sure what it was, but he's back on the field now. Did you hear that?
I did. Between that and the Musburger gambling references, it brought me right back to 2008. It felt good.
So Texas Tech doesn't move the ball their first drive, but they pinned Texas back on the 1 yard line. Beautifully executed. First play for Texas is safety. Again, it's not something I remembered at all, but Texas Tech, so the fans, they're already kind of hyped up, Mike. Is there anything better than you got an atmosphere that's like that, and then your team delivers on the opening in the first few minutes. And a touchdown, I think, is always going to be huge. But I don't know that anything gets you more amped up as a fan than seeing the defense make a huge play like that. Getting a safety, I think, took that crowd to the next level.
Yeah, the only thing that trumps a touchdown to a fan is an odd play that results in a score, right? Like a safety or a pick six or a fumble recovery for a touchdown or a kickoff for a touchdown. And this crowd went into another stratosphere when that happened. It's awesome going into these small college towns that maybe, you at this point, you didn't really watch many primetime games in Lubbock. And when these fans would get a chance to be in a primetime stage, they would absolutely deliver.
Absolutely. And this kind of is, we expected a lot of points early on, Mike, but we didn't get them necessarily. We had the safety, then Texas Tech kicked a field goal shortly after to make it 5-0. And by the way, did you Texas Tech's kicker, which I didn't remember, won his job through a kicking contest on campus. How great is that?
It was a dorm kicking contest, and Mike Leach basically tracked him down and basically said, "Hey man, you want to be the kicker?" Like such a Mike Leach move. You know what I mean? Mike Leach, sort of a quirky guy, plucking a kicker from a dorm kicking contest competition.
It's part of the reason why, like, if your kicker sucks and you're on your college team, you're like, just go find somebody on campus. There's got to be a kid on campus who can kick field goals better than this, and Mike Leach found him. I was just about blown away. We came back from a break, and Donald Trump has a message for Mike Leach. It felt so surreal. Like, we were like, wait, where are we right now? Like, is this in the moment? Like, did I switch the channel? Because it felt so odd seeing who now is the president of the country sending a message. Like, I kind of forgot how relevant he was in the national landscape, I guess. Maybe I just kind of blocked him out. But to have him send a message, like, I don't know why he was sending a message outside of him and Leach being friends during this broadcast.
Yeah, and it has Donald Trump listed as an entrepreneur, by the way. So it has Donald Trump's video message, his name, and then entrepreneur, which I thought was funny. Now, is this during the Apprentice days?
I mean, I'm sure it was, but
yeah. So he's a guy with a show that's on. The Apprentice was on NBC, wasn't it?
I was going to say it wasn't on ABC where this.
And he has enough cachet to give a video message to his quote unquote telephone buddy Mike Leach in the middle of a primetime game. And this is before Donald Trump was anything. The farthest thing you ever thought he'd be was a political figure at this point. So you have the Donald Trump cameo, which I got a kick out of also, and it completely took me by surprise. Even better is the story that Mike Leach was in New York visiting and just went up to Donald Trump's office to visit him unannounced.
Right.
And that's how the friendship started.
Can you imagine?
Those two, Mike Leach and Donald Trump. Oof.
Incredible. But yeah, so he makes an appearance early in this game, which completely, again, just caught me off guard. Tech also added a touchdown, again, a long touchdown drive. That was the story of the first half. Tech really controlled, as Kirk points out, very, very observantly, the offensive line and defensive line for Texas Tech dominated this game, which would be the last thing I would have expected going into it, that a Texas Tech front would outpower a Texas front on either side of the football. But they did in this game, and they took a 12-0 lead. And the end of this quarter, Mike, Texas had just 8 yards in the ball for 2.5 minutes.
Yeah, we can't underscore. Kirk Herbstreit's a guy who lives college football, and he's taken aback by how good the lines for Texas Tech are playing on the offense and defensive side of the ball. That's how new this was with them competing at this level. 12-0 as we head into the second quarter.
It continues to be a Tech-dominated game as they go right back down the field again. 19-0 early in the second, and at this point, Texas's first 4 possessions were a safety, a punt, 3-and-out, and 3-and-out, which is really incredible to believe with Colt McCoy, the quarterback, that they can't move the football on Texas Tech, and that's the point that they make on the broadcast is, look, they needed a defense here in Lubbock, and maybe they have it with Ruffin McNeil kind of leading the way.
Yeah, Texas Tech still dominating time of possession the whole half. You would have Texas add 2 field goals in this quarter. Okay. And after Texas Tech, the first drive of the second quarter, like you mentioned, just goes right back down, makes it 19-0. They're dominating in every phase, and the crowd is consistently going berserk. They haven't stopped. Since that safety, they're still at the same decibel level. At this point, at halftime, it's a 22-6 Texas Tech lead, and all the momentum is in their favor. It's almost like they probably didn't even want halftime to happen. They wanted to play right through.
Yeah, I mean, Texas, was able to score a few points late, but you look at the yardage and they flashed up a graphic. Texas Tech had outgained Texas by nearly 300 yards towards the end of that first half. 300 yards of offense more than Texas in one half of football, which was pretty incredible. But yeah, so it was 22-6 at the half. We don't get a lot of halftime coverage in this one. So we go straight into the third quarter. Finally, Texas gets something started, and you kind of knew it was going to happen at some point, mainly because we knew what the score was, Mike. But you just knew Texas, number one in the country. They kind of been in these situations before. They were tested. You knew they were to respond at a half under Mac Brown, and they do. Jordan Shipley, 45-yard punt return, touchdown, gets him going early in that quarter, 22-13. What do you remember about Shipley? He was a guy that I think was a very popular name because of his connection with McCoy and that duo they had, but you kind of saw that he could kind of do a lot of different things as evident by this punt return.
Yeah, sort of a shifty, effective college receiver. You know, I sort of think of him in the same mold as I think of like that Hunter Renfrow for Clemson. We mentioned him before, but Wes Welker when he was at Texas Tech. These shifty guys who could also, because they were so shifty and good in small spaces, they made good punt returners fast enough to break one as well. You know what I mean? So I remembered Shipley right away. He has a 45-yard punt return to make it 22-13. And at this point, remember, Texas still has not scored an offensive touchdown.
Yeah, that's crazy, right?
Yeah.
Arakpo gets injured too, by the way, around this time too, who, obviously one of the stars of that defense. And you know how good he ended up being, but he gets injured here, which doesn't help them as they're on the field quite a bit. I thought one interesting conversation that came up during this quarter, Mike. So Texas, there's a lot of great Big 12 receivers at this time, kind of highlighted by Crabtree. But Texas in consecutive weeks had faced Jeremy Maclin at Missouri, Des Bryant, who was playing at Oklahoma State at this time, and Michael Crabtree. They did a pretty good job with the first two guys holding them in check. But Kirk and Brent both had a discussion. Hey, if you could pick one of those three receivers for the NFL, who would you pick? They both said, and maybe playing up to the audience, Crabtree. Were they right?
At the time, remember, Crabtree ended up being a top 5 pick in the draft. I think more people, if you asked about raw ability, they would have said Des Bryant. But given some of the concerns about Des Bryant, which have magnified themselves in the pros, I could see why they erred on Crabtree. With all that said, Des Bryant ended up being the best receiver.
Did Maclin have a better NFL career than Crabtree?
Close.
Right?
Very close. Maclin was riddled with injuries.
Yeah.
Maclin didn't last as long as those other two. And they had Des Bryant as one of the player of the week nominees during one of the studio hits during this game too. You forgot about how good he was at Oklahoma State. I think though, Arakpo probably the best pro from this game that we saw, or ended up being the best pro, I think.
Yeah.
Out of those three receivers you mentioned, though, I think Bryant was the best one.
Right. So Texas gets a stop in this quarter, and you start feeling momentum's turning because it's a 9-point game. They get the ball back. They're starting to show signs of life, and then Colt throws just a horrible interception as they're backed up on their own end, and he throws a pick six to Charbonnet, who returns it in, and you're just like, man, it was probably a good defensive play as much as it was a bad decision by Colt, but that again, you had the guy ringing the bell. You knew about the guy ringing the bell before this game, right? That's something we always see in a GIF form.
Yeah, the guy ringing the bell. I didn't really realize he was that intense while he was doing it. He was really into it. But, yeah, I was aware of the guy ringing the bell.
And, again, the atmosphere is at 11 at this point. It's everything's adding up. You got game day. You got a night game. You got ABC national TV. You got number one team in the country in your home stadium. You're undefeated. You got a chance to move up potentially into the top 2 or 3 of the BCS with a win. And everything's coming together at this point, 29-13. But Texas answers pretty quickly. Malcolm Williams, 37-yard TD catch. This guy was really good, Mike. I was surprised, and he was a redshirt freshman, this receiver for Texas, Malcolm Williams. Watching him play in this game, I was surprised that he didn't have a longer career. He looked really good.
He did. He stuck out for Texas, and like you mentioned, the reason we didn't mention him at the top was I don't really remember hearing much from him going forward. So
no, and I had to actually look it up. He was, I think he ended up leaving Texas and quit football for some family reasons apparently. But he played the national championship the year after, and then the 2010 season he played as a junior, and Texas wasn't very good and ended up stepping away. But he was pretty dynamic. But this touchdown catch made it 29-19 after a failed 2-point conversion. And Tech in the third quarter, 3 possessions and 3 punts. So it completely switched going into this fourth quarter.
Yeah, and remember at this point, Texas Tech had 29 points, right? But nine of those points were from the pick six and from the safety.
Yeah.
So
good point.
And then Adam James made a catch in this quarter. Did you notice that?
I didn't notice that when you said that.
Remember what the significance of Adam James is?
Yeah. Craig James' son.
And then what happened with him and Mike Leach?
Yeah.
Unreal.
That
brought me back.
Yeah,
we'll talk, I guess. What was the whole thing this is pretty much what ended Mike Leach's tenure, or was a big part of ending Mike Leach's tenure in Lubbock, right? What did he, as a punishment, make Adam James sit in like a storage container or something like that?
Yeah, made him like sit in the dark or something. I don't remember all the details, but yeah, the way he was treated, it became a big deal, and I'd kind of forgotten about it. I mean, it's definitely faded out of my memory about that, but there was definitely contradicting stories between actually what really happened between those two. I think a trainer, said that it didn't happen, but he was recovering from a concussion at the time. That's what it was.
So they wanted to put him in the dark.
Yeah, they wanted to stick him in the dark. But yeah,
because I just remember, especially since Herb Street called out Craig James by name, saying how proud he must be. I thought it was relevant to mention that here, because that relationship between Adam and Craig James and Texas Tech. I mean, I'm sure if you ask a Texas Tech fan, that whole incident's a pretty big part of their program's history.
Yeah, and he claimed it was basically like a storage closet, electrical closet, and they stuck him in there for a few hours. I think some of the trainers said it was a bigger room with plenty of space, but whatever it was, it ultimately led to a lot of controversy and eventually Leach exiting the Texas Tech program and heading up to Washington State. So yeah, Adam James, I didn't even pay attention on the broadcast, Mike, when it happened. But yeah, that ended up being a pretty big story for this program. So fourth quarter, here we are. Texas is battling back. Tech has a really good drive to start this quarter too, but ends up getting a field goal. And Texas gets the ball back, down 10, at their own 9-yard line. And at this point still, you got to feel like Texas Tech's in great shape, right? I mean, you got Texas backed up. They haven't done anything all night. Then boom, first play, McCoy finds Malcolm Williams, who just, I don't know what happened to the defense, Mike. They were nowhere to be found. McCoy, I think when he saw it, like you could see the reaction as he threw it because he realized how open his receiver was. But Williams, 91 yards down the left sideline. And again, why I was saying why I couldn't believe that Malcolm Williams didn't have a bigger impact, because he had the size, the speed, and the hands that you would think would make him a next level receiver.
Yeah, you may think we're making a big deal about Malcolm Williams and why are we talking about him so much, but I'm telling you, when you see this kid, how fast he was during this game, and like you said, size, speed, kind of reminded me of Roy Williams, former Texas receiver in that respect. He was a stud.
He was a stud. So this makes it tightens the game up now. And Texas, look, is right there in this game. The kind of finish this game is pretty wild, because for the most part, this first 3.5 quarters, it was all Texas Tech, and this really hadn't been that great of a game. But as we wind down, we start kind of seeing that Texas is going to make this very interesting. So Tech drives down, puts a good drive together. They get down goal to go. Crabtree gets hit with the penalty. They get pushed back. They settle for a field goal. Now, all of a sudden, it's just 32-26, under 6 minutes left. And I think this is the first time you probably have some panic as a Texas Tech fan, because you've led this whole game by multiple possessions, and all of a sudden this thing sets up at 6, Mike. As a fan of that team that's up 6 points and the momentum shifting, and there's essentially less than 6 minutes, so one possession, maybe 2 possessions, you might not even get the ball back. This is that time that you start to panic up 6 points.
When you're a fan of a team that has not had much success, right? You always are waiting for the other shoe to drop when your team is doing something that they've never done before, right? That's the spot that these fans in that stadium for Texas Tech and watching at home are in right now. I've been in that situation so many times as a Jets fan, I can't tell you. You're equal parts shocked when they actually come through and make plays they should make. Yeah. You're just like, you know what I mean? Yeah. So I've been there as a Texas Tech fan, and they're standing down the barrel of Colt McCoy, at that point, the Heisman Trophy front runner, getting the ball back with about 5 minutes and 45 seconds left, looking to drive down the field. And
they would. I mean, Texas moved down the field pretty quickly. What I was surprised about, Mike, because they ended up punching it in with 1:29 left to take that 1-point lead. I was surprised at how poorly they managed the clock. It seemed like, and I know they had to score and they had to move, and their offense wasn't a really grinded out offense, but they were snapping the ball, especially when they were inside the 20 or 15, where they only had a handful of plays left. You knew that no matter what happened, you only have a handful of downs left to score this touchdown. So let's make sure we do it with little time. But they were snapping the ball with 15, 18 seconds left on the play clock, even with the ball inside the 20.
Yeah, to hit on your point, Ben, it's a very good point. They got the ball back with 5:45 left. They scored the touchdown with 1:30 remaining. They went on a 12-play drive. That's how fast they were snapping the ball.
Yeah.
They did 12 plays in what, a little over 3 minutes?
Yeah, 4 minutes maybe.
4 minutes, sorry. Yeah, crazy. You're right. And especially from a team that veteran coach, veteran quarterback, it was a little surprising.
And so Texas Tech now has 1:30 left, and that's way too much time for an offense like this that can throw the ball. And it was a great final drive too, because you had Texas Tech with Graham Harrell, this atmosphere, trying to launch this comeback, and all it needs is a field goal. And you're thinking maybe it's going to rely on this field goal kicker that was plucked out of a dorm room, a few weeks ago. God, are we really going to count on that? They drive all the way down the field, and what happens, Mike, and I'd forgotten this play completely, but Texas has a surefire interception. One of these balls that deflects off the hand of a receiver or defender, that it floats up in the air, and it's just hanging there. And those sometimes seem to be the hardest ones to catch. This ball, it's floating, Mike, floating through the air. Could not have been easier. It goes directly through his arms as he has him kind of outstretched, trying to cradle it into his stomach. Goes right through his arms, straight down to the turf for an incompletion.
It looked like an interception, a sure interception, to the point that Musburger yelled interception, right? Like, it was one of these ones where it just looked like a foregone conclusion. It looked like the ball was up in the air forever. It was just going to drop in the Texas defender's hands, and that was going to be it. Now, this is that was a second down play with 8 seconds left. Mm-hmm. And it's one of these plays, there seems to be one in every game we do, where it has a big role in the outcome, but because of how the game ends, you completely forget about it.
Yeah, it was Blake Gideon was unable to catch it. A very solid player for Texas. He was a safety for them, but that was it. That was the game. It was over. Texas had escaped what should have been a loss for them at that point. But there's 8 seconds left, and again, Mike, you're thinking there's not a lot of time here. What do you do 8 seconds from, what were they, about the 28-yard line, somewhere in there? They were a decent ways out. So you're not a guaranteed field goal, but you don't have a lot of time to work with. Easy. We've seen many teams run out the clock in the spot. Just poor management, a guy not paying attention that goes down in bounds or doesn't get out of bounds or tries to extend a play when it doesn't need to. A lot of situations can happen here. But Harrell finds Crabtree, and this catch is one that I think most college football fans recall and remember, because it was just so incredible and improbable, really. A little, almost an out at the sideline, and Crabtree is able to make the catch along the sideline, hold off the defender who's kind of pulling him towards the sideline, tiptoe, get around him, and take that ball to the end zone. And when you watch it in real time, still, it's so unlikely that he's able to keep that ball in bounds to score. You thought, yeah, get out of bounds, set the field goal, and he could have had that opportunity. But to extend that play and score a touchdown, it was remarkable. It was the play of the year, probably.
Yeah, if you're a college football fan, you remember this play. Even if you're not remembering by us talking about it right now, go look at it. You've seen it most commonly from the view from the back of the end zone, with Crabtree catching the ball and sort of tiptoeing down the sideline after breaking free from the defenders. If you don't know it from that description, Musburger's call, the Crabtree breaks free and touchdown, you know that call. One of the plays from the last probably 10, 15 years of college football that you remember. And look, risky play, 8 seconds left, right? To throw the ball up like that to Crabtree. Risky play, worked out. It was one of those plays where, hey, look, we're gonna throw the ball up to our best player and see if he can make a play. And he did.
Yeah, it kind of solidified Crabtree's legacy. We knew how good he was, and then he makes that play on that national stage against Texas, knocks off the number 1 team. It defined Crabtree, and that was, everybody was legitimized him, and everybody's like, yeah, this is why all the hype's been there for Crabtree. Look at the play he just made. But the final seconds in this game were pretty crazy. Fans stormed the field after this catch. There's still a second left on the clock, which I'm surprised that I don't know how, as an operator, you don't run the clock out there. But I give credit to the home field not keeping the second on the clock. But the crowd storms the field, so you have to get them off the field. They kick the extra point. They storm the field again. There's multiple penalties for the crowd on sportsmanlike conduct. It was one of the oddest shots you'll see of the crowd now that's been pushed off the field. Everybody is lining the field, right? They're 10, 15, 20 deep along the sideline, along the end line, behind the end zone, and the near sideline. with the ball now backed up to the 7.5-yard line. So
remember, Ben, what's important to mention is the first time they stormed the field was to review the touchdown catch.
Right.
Which they did. Then the fans stormed again after they announced that he was inbounds and it was a touchdown. Then, so this is the second time they've stormed. Now they have to get him off the field again, and the kickoff happens.
Yeah, they're kicking off from the 7.5-yard line. Everything like it felt like in this entire crowd, you probably had 80% of the people in the stadium inside the 20-yard line.
Yeah, that was bizarre. It was bizarre.
It was a very odd finish, and kicking off from 7.5. I mean, anything can happen, and they squib it, and Texas isn't able to do anything with it. And the clock runs out, and then all madness ensues. I mean, it was the field was full in probably about 4.5 seconds. It felt like, but pretty remarkable game, great finish, and Texas Tech holds off Texas in that game to pull the upset. And then the next week, Alabama number 1 in the country, Mike. The rest is history. Texas Tech did move up to number 2 in the BCS after that win, but would only remain there a couple of weeks because they would lose to Oklahoma.
They got thumped by Oklahoma.
Yeah,
that Oklahoma performance for Sam Bradford, cemented him as the Heisman winner.
Yeah, it did. It finished them off, and it's crazy too because Texas after that win was right back at number 2 in the BCS. I don't know if you remember that. It was Alabama, Texas, Oklahoma in the BCS as Florida was still lingering behind and waiting for their opportunity because Florida, this is the Tebow year where they lost to Ole Miss, and he promised in his post-game speech that they would never lose another game as far as he could control it, and they wouldn't. They would go on to win the national championship, beating Alabama in the SEC championship, knocking off Alabama's undefeated season. But a remarkable finish there, Mike. Let's do some outdated items real quick. I don't know what you had. This is only 12 years ago, so not that old, but there were some outdated items for me. I'll start with Texas Tech basketball coach Pat Knight handing out pizzas to the fans as they showed him and showed some Texas Tech practice highlights. This is a very optimistic period in Texas Tech basketball. They've actually become very good under Chris Beard since this time. But Pat Knight taking over, I'd kind of forgotten him a little bit there, but this was the very Knight heavy and a very crazy coaching era in Lubbock at this time.
Yeah, you had, it's like when Bobby is like big fish, small pond, right? When Bobby Knight announced he was going to Texas Tech, it was like, what? Texas Tech, out of all the places he could go? And he brought his son with him, Pat Knight. You had Mike Leach as the football coach. Very interesting time to be in Lubbock. I got also, as we were seeing highlights and scores from other games going on, USC was destroying Washington, and it kind of you could tell how outdated this was, because USC was really good at this time, but also Washington was 0-7 at this point. And Washington's become one of the more consistent Pac-12 programs really since the playoff era and a little before that under Chris Peterson, who's since left. But that was outdated to me completely. Yeah, you bring up a good point because you got to remember at this time you had Washington faltering. You had Boise State as one of the preeminent up-and-coming programs in the country, coached by Chris Peterson. Yeah. And that began the Washington's pursuit of Chris Peterson over a number of years, who they eventually landed. Yeah, you had Utah and Boise State undefeated in that final week of the season, outside of obviously the BCS. Probably wouldn't even have made a playoff, but that's back when that conversation raged on quite a bit. Also, one other outdated item I have, Mike, this is 1 week. This is not even a week. This is a handful of days before the 2008 election. Yeah, you had McCain and Obama were going to do interviews on Monday Night Football, so 2 days from the play at the date of this game. We're going to do interviews at halftime with Chris Berman, and it was going to be the last time they were going to appear and do any interviews before the election. Wild. That's wild. So yeah, Chris Berman's landing those interviews at the halftime of Monday Night Football with both candidates. Yeah, unbelievable. We saw how that turned out. Do you have any outdated items? Yeah, the promo for Extreme Makeover Home Edition. Did you watch that show? That show was huge. Yeah, I used to even watch that show a little bit, and I'm not like a huge TV guy. Yeah. Yeah, as bad for those of you who are not aware, and no one's probably aware of this, all I pretty much do is watch documentaries. So I'm that guy. True crime docs. That's about it. So I was not yet into that as of now. Like I said, this was my heyday. So I was still watching live TV. Yeah, what a heyday it was. And look, any other outdated items? Because I think again, it wasn't super old. It was there's still most of the stuff we kind of were pretty comfortable with, but a lot has changed in these 12 years. Yeah, no, I have some of the graphics on the screen were different, but other than that, that's all I caught. Yeah, that's all I got there. So, the big what if for me in this game, Mike, for Texas,
a couple of missed plays, really some opportunities they had. They could have won this game, including that interception with Gideon. And I wonder if Texas wins that game, where do they go the rest of the season? Because they would go on. They didn't lose a game the rest of the year. The schedule got much easier. They even beat Ohio State in the Fiesta Bowl to finish out the year. I don't think there's any way they beat Florida this season. I think Florida was by far the best, but I think they would have given – I don't even know. Do you think they would have given Florida a better game than Oklahoma did that year?
No, I don't. I think Florida was an absolute juggernaut that year. And outside of Alabama beating them in the SEC championship, I don't think anyone was going to.
Okay. I mean,
I think it was a classic slip up early in the year against Ole Miss, like you mentioned. But that roster were just loaded. I didn't think this was a particularly great Texas team.
Yeah, it didn't feel that way. I mean, they ended up being very good by the record. But yeah, I mean, the national championship, Florida won 24-14. And I think did we watch that game at Sliders? I think we might have actually watched that game at Sliders. Do you remember?
Yeah, I think we did.
I think we did. Yeah.
Yeah.
24-14 was the final in that game. I don't know that the Texas would have done a much better job, but they would have been in that game either way, playing for the national championship.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Not for that. And then the next year they would go on and play in the national championship against Alabama and lose that Rose Bowl game. Where Texas Tech has had some good years. I mean, this was their best year. I think they would go on to finish up this season. They would lose to Oklahoma a couple weeks later. They would end up losing again in the Cotton Bowl to Ole Miss in a shootout, 47-34. But all in all, a really good year for Mike Leach and this Texas Tech team.
Yeah, Texas Tech, this was sort of their, when I think of Texas Tech football, this was their one shining light across the college football primetime landscape, and they're perennially a team that wins between 6 and 8 games.
Yeah, it sure feels that way.
That's just what they were before this, and it's what they are after.
Yeah, they've had some good years, some good players. I mean, obviously Patrick Mahomes, one of the greats now in the NFL, but yeah, they've had some good years, and but yeah, they consistently, it seems like 7-8 wins is kind of their spot, and they're happy there. If they can sneak up and get 9 or 10, it's been a heck of a year. But this was a great team. This was a heck of a game, and one to close out. Mike, any other thoughts on this game before we wrap it up?
No, just I highly recommend going back and watching it, especially in an era where we don't have fans at the games. It'll really bring you back to how awesome it is and how awesome this crowd was. And
honestly, how much of an impact a home crowd makes, because you're talking about games this year in 2020 where it's hard to pull an upset as it is against these really good teams. And this was a very top 10 matchup, so it wasn't like a big upset technically. But to my point is it's just you rely so much on the atmosphere and the momentum that your crowd can give you. And they were able to do that in this game. And I think it put Texas behind the 8 ball early on and ultimately unable to overcome that later in the game. So good point there, Mike. And we will have that game up on our website, distantreplaypodcast.com, so you can go and watch it there. If you want to relive this game in its entirety, we'll have it there. But you can follow us as well on Twitter, on Instagram, and every episode will be archived right there on YouTube as well. So subscribe there, subscribe on whatever platform you listen to your podcasts, and leave us a review. We would appreciate that as well. And if you have any games you want us to talk about, send them to us. Leave us a comment on any of those platforms, and we will put them on our list of games to watch. Mike enjoyed this one. Good to go back to some college football, back to the Big 12's dominant era in the early 2000s, and watch this Crabtree performance.
This was a great one, Benny, and until next time.